Just last week, during my final days at home before returning to college, something unsettling happened. I've been wrestling with whether to share this, but the thoughts about what's going on at home won't leave me alone. My parents recently relocated after I finished high school. They'd been discussing downsizing for ages, and with me heading off to college, they finally made the move. I'd only visited the new house a few times. When they first bought it, they gave me a quick walkthrough, showing me the layout and mentioning some quirks of the older property. One detail they emphasized was that the house lacked a basement, only having a crawl space for utilities. They seemed certain, so I didn't question it. My parents had left the previous evening for a week-long trip, leaving me alone in the house. The first odd moment came on a Tuesday night. As I lay in bed, struggling to sleep, I heard a steady tapping noise from directly beneath the floor. It was rhythmic and consistent in volume. At first, I chalked it up to the heating system or pipes settling, but the sound persisted, making me doubt my initial assumptions. I should note that my bedroom is on the ground floor, so the noises were definitely coming from below ground. I got up and paced the room, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to echo from all over beneath the floor. What unnerved me was that, according to my parents, there was only a crawl space down there, nothing else. The thought of hearing noises from below when there shouldn't be any habitable space was deeply disturbing. Eventually, the tapping ceased, and I managed to drift off. The next morning, I convinced myself it was over, likely just typical old house creaks or an animal in the crawl space. I was completely mistaken. The following night, at about the same time, the tapping returned, but this time it was noticeably louder. I brushed it off and went to sleep, though I felt far more uneasy than the first night. When the noises came back a third night in a row, I knew something was seriously off. That night, the sounds escalated dramatically. Alongside the tapping, I heard dragging and scraping noises, like an animal clawing at something and occasionally pulling an object. That's the best way I can describe it. I kept trying to reconcile the sounds with what I knew about the house. My rational side insisted there had to be a logical explanation, but none came to mind. The noises were too distinct and deliberate to dismiss as ordinary house sounds. I began to wonder if my parents were mistaken about the crawl space, or if there was some utility access I didn't know about. Either way, sitting in that dark room with only scraping and tapping for company was eerie. The next morning, I called my parents to explain what was happening. My dad immediately suggested checking the crawl space for animals, concerned something might have gotten in. I was reluctant to investigate, but felt I had no choice. The crawl space entrance is under the porch, so I had to get my hands dirty to check it properly. Holding my breath and dreading what I might find, I looked inside and found nothing, not even animals. My dad seemed content with this and told me not to worry, but I was far from satisfied and grew frustrated by the lack of answers. I decided to search for other explanations, like an external access point I might have missed or signs of animals entering elsewhere. While inspecting the house's exterior, I noticed a stack of old construction materials against one side. Lumber, tarps, concrete blocks, things like that. They seemed to have been there for a while, likely leftovers from a past renovation. I'd seen them before but never paid much attention, as they'd never seemed relevant. I started shifting the materials, thinking they might be hiding an opening animals could use to get under the house. What I found was far worse. Concealed behind the pile was a storm door, completely hidden. It was partially painted over and clearly hadn't been used in years, but was undeniably a real entrance. I opened it and discovered concrete steps descending into what was unmistakably a basement. I was stunned. My parents had been entirely wrong about the house not having one. I didn't want to go down there, not at all, but I did. In the short time I spent below, two things became clear. Someone had been living in that basement, evident from the scattered empty food containers. And whoever it was wasn't an ordinary homeless person, as shown by the markings scratched into the wooden foundation. There were tally-like scratch marks on one pillar and disturbing drawings on another. Images of people and animals, but in a deeply twisted, unsettling way. I won't describe them further. I left quickly. It was the most terrifying scene I've ever encountered. I immediately called my parents to report what I'd found. They were shocked, insisting they had no idea there was a basement, let alone that someone had been living in it. My dad repeatedly asked if I was sure no one was down there now, and I assured him it was empty. He said they'd cut their trip short and return home right away. After hanging up, I went straight to buy a heavy-duty padlock. I secured the storm door from the outside, hoping it would prevent whoever had been there from returning. That same night, I was jolted awake by loud banging and rattling coming from outside. I immediately recognized the sound. A person was attempting to return to the basement, and was obviously annoyed that the entrance was secured at this point. The pounding was incredibly intense and aggressive, making me worry they could actually force their way through. I recall becoming completely still as my pulse began to quicken. I was paralyzed. When the noise ceased, it snapped me out of it. I quietly approached the window and peered outside, catching a glimpse of a shape dashing through the rear yard into the shadows. I failed to discern any specifics about the individual, but watching them escape heightened the sense of danger and reality in the moment. The remainder of the evening passed in a haze, to be frank, mainly due to how frightened and rattled I felt, even though I dislike acknowledging it. Law enforcement conducted a detailed inspection of the residence, basement included, but naturally discovered no trace. Their options were limited to committing to more frequent checks in the neighborhood. My folks returned the following morning, and they assured me things would normalize with their presence. They mentioned they'd collaborate on a lasting fix, and urged me not to dwell on it further. I departed for university the next day as scheduled, yet I remained deeply disturbed by the ordeal then and now. It seemed improper to abandon my parents by themselves, particularly given our total lack of details on the intruder who'd essentially resided in our home for an unknown duration. Only a short time has elapsed since my departure, and I've been nervously anticipating updates from my parents regarding any further incidents. Up to now, none have arisen, but that fails to calm me whatsoever. Those disturbing symbols I uncovered downstairs keep haunting my thoughts, particularly the cruel illustrations. I struggle to fathom the activities that individual engage in below. Truthfully, I'm genuinely frightened that another event might unfold. Music. I was raised in a tiny community several miles from the boundary between Montana and Idaho. I lived on the Montana portion. Very little occurs in these parts. And truthfully, that's a key factor in my decision to stay. This took place ages ago, prior to everyone carrying mobile devices and being constantly connected. Frankly, my region remains largely unchanged from that era, which contributes to why the incident I'm describing lingers so vividly in my mind. It occurred at the close of August, during one of those concluding summer afternoons where the shift toward autumn is already noticeable. That daybreak, I followed my standard path to my job, along a simple two-lane road weaving through agricultural fields and gentle slopes. Roughly a quarter-hour long, I noticed a vehicle stopped at the roadside. It was a pale blue vintage sedan, appearing as if it had sat there for some time. It remained parked on the edge. No flashers activated, nobody visible nearby, simply positioned there, tilted a bit toward the drainage area. Look, I'm not naive, but I am the sort who assists others when required. That's simply my upbringing. As I neared, I reduced speed to observe more closely. The engine wasn't on, and no one appeared to be occupying it. Empty driver's position, front passenger area, and rear seats. It struck me as odd, particularly at that hour, though not necessarily worrisome. Folks experience breakdowns and seek aid on foot regularly around here. I assumed perhaps mechanical issues prompted someone to trek to the closest farm, so I continued onward. I needed to reach my shift, and it didn't appear urgent. Truth be told, the matter slipped my mind entirely by quitting time. However, on my return drive, I encountered that identical vehicle in the precise location. The sole variation was the driver's door now standing fully ajar. It hadn't been that way earlier. I was positive. I decelerated once more, straining to see while passing. Yet still, no indication of anybody. No pedestrians in the vicinity, no visible footprints. Just that aged automobile lingering with an entrance flung wide, as if the occupant had exited hastily and failed to return. On this occasion, I didn't dismiss it. Once I regained reception, I stopped and dialed a routine assistance number. I described the location and observations to the dispatcher, who expressed gratitude and noted that a check would occur. During my commute to work the subsequent day, the car had vanished at last. Thus, I presumed that concluded the matter. Around 7 days afterward, during my morning meal, a segment on the regional broadcast drew my notice. Apparently, authorities were examining a disappearance. Details involved a deserted automobile discovered beside a countryside road segment near the community. The descriptions matched my experience perfectly. I made the link right away and increased the sound on my set. They withheld the individual's identity, but mentioned the vehicle belonged to an outsider who hadn't arrived at his intended destination. According to officials, no evidence suggested criminal activity, and no observers existed. I've long held mild doubts about reporting outlets, so I questioned the narrative presented by the broadcasters. Regardless, it was unsettling that I'd essentially observed the scenario as it unfolded. Reflecting on it, I could have been the initial or perhaps sole individual to alert anyone about that roadside vehicle. It created an unusual sensation. I attempted to proceed normally, but failed. My interest intensified. As mentioned, events are rare here, so an anomaly like this proved too intriguing to overlook. The following daybreak, I phoned my sibling. I'll refer to him as Benjamin. He works as a firefighter nearby, not precisely my locale, but sufficiently close that we share similar updates. That's typical in this region. I sought to inquire if he possessed insights from law enforcement, knowing they frequently exchange information. He confirmed receiving a notice from the sheriff's department concerning the forsaken vehicle and the associated disappearance. I questioned whether authorities intended any actions. He lacked certainty, but suggested a search might eventually form. Details were sparse beyond that. I proposed we participate, and perhaps recruit some colleagues from his unit as well. Initially, he wondered about my strong involvement, but I persuaded him. Incidentally, I'm unclear on my own insistence. I suppose I sensed a personal tie to it. I lacked knowledge on liaising with police for the effort, so I delegated that to my brother. In a few days, with approval naturally, he arranged it. Authorities had already intended a sweep and welcomed extra support. It remained modest, involving several deputies, volunteer firefighters, and myself. The focus lay on a light forested zone and some aged water channels bordering the roadway. From a vehicle, the landscape seemed unremarkable, but walking revealed how readily one could become disoriented or concealed. We divided into duos for optimal coverage. Naturally, I teamed with my brother. Roughly 60 minutes later, a duo signaled via radio. They'd noticed an item amid the foliage gap. We all hurried to their position promptly. It proved to be an antiquated utility structure, seemingly in use for ages. The building sat partially embedded in soil, with vegetation climbing its exterior. From the pavement, its presence would escape notice. The entry stood marginally ajar, and the fastening mechanism appeared fractured. Within, the atmosphere felt dim and dank, typical for a deserted spot. But as my vision adapted, I observed indications of recent occupation. Scattered plastic containers and snack packaging littered the area in an intentional manner. The group dispersed to examine for further clues inside and externally. A firefighter mentioned detecting something near the rear panel. Thus, we gathered to inspect. A neat, compact opening pierced the timber plank low to the ground. The aperture featured jagged, fragmented borders unlike natural deterioration from elements or decay. It resembled a gunfire perforation precisely. We combed the interior and surroundings meticulously for ammunition remnants, projectiles, or blood traces, yet uncovered none. Merely that lone puzzling puncture in the structure, a logical absence supporting proof. The deputies contacted headquarters about the find, and their demeanor indicated escalation beyond a standard disappearance. The commanding deputy assembled everyone and stated they'd man it from that point. He then directed me specifically to depart, being the lone non-professional. I experienced rejection and irritation, but compliance was necessary, so I exited. Upon contacting Benjamin that night, he offered evasive replies regarding post-departure events. He finally conceded that the firefighters departed soon after my exit. Authorities had essentially evacuated all and assumed full control. In the ensuing weeks, I sought developments. Benjamin's police acquaintances professed ignorance of case specifics, which struck me as peculiar. Regional broadcasts omitted any continuation past the initial disappearance alert. It appeared the issue had silently faded. Ultimately, I resolved to revisit and locate the structure independently. I felt confident in recalling its position. Thus, one afternoon I traveled the route until reaching our search starting point. I wandered for hours through the zone where I firmly believed the building resided. I traced the water channels precisely. The landscape and overhead conditions mirrored that day exactly, yet nothing appeared. No structure visible. I began doubting my recollection. I considered a minor possibility of incorrect pinpointing, but even so, it ought to have surfaced within that vicinity. I explored alternate portions of the zone, then more, but yielded nothing. It felt profoundly odd, more so than my current depiction. I recall pausing amid that tangled underbrush, utterly isolated save for occasional soft winds brushing by. Serene, sure but bizarre. The sole alternative notion was perhaps officials had dismantled the structure completely. Extracting and transporting it wouldn't prove overly challenging, though it appeared excessive for an ordinary disappearance inquiry. Those represented the only possibilities. However, either my recall faltered or the building ceased to exist. I departed soon thereafter. Little remained for me to accomplish. I retained this uneasy sensation that a significant occurrence transpired amid those waning summer moments. An event I momentarily glimpsed prior to total exclusion. Annually, as August concludes and that recognizable atmospheric change emerges, I reflect on that forsaken vehicle and the gunfire marking a structure that might never have been real. Music. This occurred last August, and it's totally altered my perspective on camping alone. As a child, my father maintained this late summer ritual of bringing me and my sibling on an outdoor excursion around mid-August. Nothing fancy, simply several days amid nature to signify summer's close before classes resumed. Now in my upper 20s, with a committed partner and advancing in various aspects, I've strived to sustain that late summer camping practice. Occasionally, I persuade my dad and brother to accompany, but typically it's solitary since my partner despises the activity. I avoid forcing her into discomfort for a trio of days. Thus, I've adapted to the isolation. For this specific outing, I'd identified an ideal location via online maps. Some arbitrary, secluded glade lacking formal designation as a campground. It sat distant from paths or roadways, ensuring total seclusion for the duration. I prefer genuine solitude, avoiding encirclement by vehicles and noisy households as at designated areas. I saved a map for offline use, a precaution I always take. The trek inward lasted perhaps 120 minutes. I'm reasonably fit, but laden with supplies, so I proceeded leisurely. I continued until locating an appropriate tent site. It matched my expectations closely, a level spot encircled by dense evergreens featuring a modest opening for sky observation. That initial evening proved ideal, truly. Solely myself, my reflections, free from inquiries about employment or marriage timelines or similar. I built a modest blaze, prepared a dehydrated noodle dish that turned out quite decent, and observed the stars. The following morning, I resolved to trek over to a river close by that I'd marked on my map. I thought I'd attempt to snag a fish for my evening meal. It seemed far more genuine than relying solely on the store-bought provisions I'd hauled along for the entire outing. Besides, it would help pass the hours, and in that kind of isolation, time stretches out endlessly. I ended up lingering by the water all day long, yet I didn't resent it one bit. The spot was serene and tranquil, and despite my lack of real angling skills, fortune smiled on me. I reeled in a respectable brook trout. I stashed it in my portable cooler and set off toward camp. I felt a swell of self-satisfaction. My father would have beamed with approval. The issue arose because I'd badly misjudged the timing of dusk and overlooked the true distance of my outbound hike. A simple stroll back to my site morphed into a stumbling journey through the trees once the sun had dipped below the horizon. In roughly 20 minutes, the warm glow of twilight faded into utter blackness. I carried a headlamp. Yet the unknown landscape forced me to proceed with caution, inching along deliberately. Eventually, I spotted a dim glow far off. It seemed to swing gently in a steady rhythm, as if carried by someone bearing a lantern or beam. Initially, a wave of ease washed over me. Perhaps another outdoor enthusiast was nearby. We might assist one another in finding our way to safety. After all, wandering dense backcountry so late surely signals a major blunder or poor planning, much like my own slip-up. As I observed the glow, it dawned on me that it was drawing nearer, suggesting its bearer was heading my way. To avoid alarming them, I chose to reveal myself and shouted a warm greeting, then inquired if they were out camping as well. I aimed for a tone that was warm and utterly non-threatening. The motion halted abruptly. I observed it hovering motionless for a stretch of seconds, which puzzled me. Then, out of the blue, it extinguished entirely, which unnerved me even more. A handful more seconds ticked by, as I fixed my gaze on the now inky void where the illumination had lingered. Suddenly, a ferocious thrashing erupted from the brush, resembling a figure bolting at top speed across the woodland. Not advancing on me or fleeing from me, but veering sharply left, at a right angle to my position. There was no mistaking it. My pulse raced fiercely by then. The episode left me profoundly rattled. I struggled to convey the depth of my unease. Every element felt profoundly amiss. What could prompt such a frantic dash? Even if my voice had jarred them, a typical response might involve a reply no, or at minimum, a cautious retreat, not a wild charge into the night-shrouded trees. I wrestled with explanations the entire return to my sight. The most plausible one I mustered was that my shout had terrified them somehow. They couldn't have known my intentions were harmless, and stumbling upon an unknown figure in remote darkness would unsettle most folks. Yet, despite that, a nagging sense of wrongness clung to me. The area's remoteness suggested few, if any, other campers, and ordinarily, people acknowledge a cordial call, especially one as benign as mine. I quickened my steps and reached my sight, but the disquiet lingered so intensely that I skipped building a blaze to prepare the fish. Instead, I hunkered in my shelter, munched on some trail rations, and attempted to lose myself in my novel before turning in early. I tend to sleep soundly under normal circumstances, particularly after a draining day of trails and fresh air. Thus, jolting awake abruptly during the wee hours signaled trouble. I strained to attune to the ambient sounds for several minutes, yet all seemed routine, the standard symphony of woodland murmurs one anticipates. Prior to drifting off again, I recognized the need to venture out for a quick personal break. I eased open the tent flap and began easing my head through. Lunar light bathed the area generously, allowing a clear sight of the open space sans my lamp. The instant my eyes adjusted to the full panorama of camp, I went rigid. A figure loomed perhaps 15 feet from my shelter. Details escaped me, just the outline of a human form in a spot utterly devoid of any such presence. They remained utterly still, as though scrutinizing my tent. I'd never faced anything remotely similar, and truly, I was at a loss for action. Thoughts whirled chaotically, but paralysis gripped my limbs. Undoubtedly, this intruder had detected the zipper's rasp or my stirrings, and they must realize I remained oblivious to their vigil. Confrontation, or worse, loomed perilously close. The moment peril framed my mind in stark survival terms. Adrenaline surged, shattering my stupor. I groped for the flick knife I stowed near the doorway and bellowed a demand to identify themselves. At the sound of my voice, the shadow lunged straight at my tent, blindsiding me utterly. No prelude, just an explosive burst into a frenzied dash, unleashing a piercing, eerie wail that bore no resemblance to humanity. Impact struck before comprehension could form. We tumbled across the earth in a tangle, and the assailant, indisputably male, from the guttural tones, lunged at my features with feral swipes, not blows but savage rends aimed to lacerate. I wedged the blade between our forms and slashed his grip amid the chaos, losing hold of it in the fray. Though the gash wasn't pristine, wounding his hand proved decisive. He erupted in agonized howls and recoiled from me. He barreled into the undergrowth once more. This round, though, his cries twisted into wails or cackles or some deranged cacophony. I lingered in stunned inertia for an eternity, grappling with the ordeal. My cheeks burned from the gashes. Fingers quivered without cease. Warmth trickled across my skin. Blood, I presumed. Mine is impossible to discern. Fleeing to my vehicle crossed my mind, but groping through ebonywood struck me as suicide over hunkering down. Only one path remained. Huddling in my tent till dawn, knife clutched tight, ears pricked to every rustle, braced for his return. It dragged on as the most interminable vigil imaginable, yet morning finally broke. At the first hints of visibility, I bundled my belongings in hushed haste and hastened to my ride far swifter than my inbound plod. Upon arrival, I floored from the sight without hesitation. Reporting to authorities tempted me, but what tale could I spin? A fellow lunged at me amid my unsanctioned bivouac. They'd likely dismiss it as the peril of solitary ventures in forsaken terrain. So I held my tongue. En route home, reflections looped on my brush with calamity. Absent that blade, or had he pressed on post/, the outcome might have veered catastrophically. Yet that's scarcely the wildest twist. What truly unravels my thoughts is his mere existence there. Plainly, he wasn't encamped, nor remotely ordinary. That screamed evident from his pursuit through inky void and unprovoked assault. And that howl, recalling its savagery, chills me still. Unmistakably mortal, yet warped into something profoundly aberrant. I haven't ventured lone under stars since, and doubt I shall.